So, in today's podcast, I want to go back to a very core concept that you need to understand as we move in, right? In a previous podcast, I spoke about the definition of corporate strategy, I explained what is corporate strategy. And I said that irrespective of what anyone tells you, if you go into a strategy study where the key question is known to you, the objective function you are maximizing is known to you, that is not corporate strategy. Because corporate strategy is not about knowing how to maximize an objective function, it's about choosing the objective function you want to maximize. That's the key difference between corporate strategy and every other kind of strategy, right? No matter what anyone tells you, even if you're reporting to the CEO, it doesn't mean you're doing corporate strategy. You're doing influential work if you report to the CEO, but that's a different issue. But if you're going to do corporate strategy, you have to report to the CEO generally, but you have to be determining the objective function that needs to be maximized. If you're not clear with this concept of objective function, go back and listen to the earlier podcast where I talked about what is corporate strategy and the differences with corporate strategy, right? Now, there's another important requirement in corporate strategy. Before I get to that, I'm going to point out one other observation. If you generally like number crunching and analysis and like going through income statements and balance sheets, you have the foundation to be a great corporate strategist. But the reality is, corporate strategy, while it is very analytic, it is a very non-quantitative analytic. Right? You're going to see the way we analyze this problem. If you've been watching the study and if you're a subscriber, you'll see the way we analyze the problem, the way we built the logic. The logic is impeccable. It makes perfect sense. But if you're looking at this and saying, okay, what analysis would I need to do to arrive at this perfect logic Michael and his team came up with? There's no analysis for that. That's what I'm trying to say. It is an analytic process, but an analytic process not built on numbers. And if you rely on a number crunching ability to do corporate strategy work, you're going to produce very weak corporate strategy. Because a lot of the issues can't be crunched out of, right? You can't crunch your way into them. So be clear about that, right? This lack of numerical analysis is very common in corporate strategy. It's about subjectivity, looking at what a company does, looking at what they need to do, and weaving together an argument. Now, I've listed all of that out in the study, so I'm not going to go through it. It's a set of podcasts by itself, but be aware of that. Now I'm going to come to the second important rule. So whenever I'm doing a corporate strategy study, I'll look at these two things. First, is there an objective function? If there's no, high probability is corporate strategy. Two, the second condition is that you must be helping a client pick a market in which it will play. This is not about market entry strategy. You may not be entering a market at all. You could be in a country and saying, oh, you know what? Our core business of selling cars to convertibles is declining. What should we do next? That's picking a new market, right? Now, if you're not picking a new market and you're not dealing with the situation where there's no objective function, you're not doing corporate strategy. That's the rule, right? That's that simple. Now, what do I mean by picking a winning market? Well, to understand this better, I think the best book written by this subject by any consultant anywhere in the world is The Strategy Paradox by Michael Rayner. So Michael Rayner is, I think he's a graduate of the Ivy Business School in Canada. And I think he also went to Harvard for his undergraduate, but I can't be sure about that. And I think he went back to Harvard to do his DBA and get his PhD, right? And it's a very good book. I would strongly urge you to read that book. What he points out is what he calls it the paradox of a good strategy. If you pick a market, let's assume you want to go after the low-income consumer in the United States, like what Walmart is targeting, right? And you say that if you perfectly organize the company to target that market, if you perfectly train your employees to make decisions to get produce at a lower cost so you can sell it at a lower price to your consumers, if you perfectly build this culture of aggressively and completely being in tune with this low-cost market, if the market changes, and let's say Americans become much wealthier and no one wants to buy low-cost stuff, it's virtually impossible for Walmart in the short to medium term to change its culture, to change its practices, to change its relationships, to change its organizational structure to move high-end. So the market moves away from Walmart rather than Walmart doing anything wrong. And what Michael Rayner rightly argues is that forget all the companies that were just bad at execution and picked the wrong market. Look at the companies that were great at execution, picked the right market, and had great implementation. A lot of them fail not because they were bad at anything, but the market just moved away from them. And what he doesn't actually say this, I think, but what he is actually implying is something that's true in strategy consulting. It is impossible. There's no analytic tool in the world today, none. No matter what any firm says, there's no analytic tool in the world today that can determine with a high degree of certainty which markets will dominate in the future. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not true. I mean, I can do a, compound annual growth analysis to see how a market is growing. I can do X, I can do Y, but just think about that for a second, right? Just because a market is growing now doesn't mean something cannot come along tomorrow and change that market. 9/11 came along and wiped out several markets, right? The oil crash is wiping out several markets. In technology, you don't know who's sitting in a basement somewhere that's going to create a product that's going to derail you. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you cannot know with absolute certainty, in fact, I would say you cannot know with a high degree of certainty how markets will evolve. No consultant, no one in the world can predict it. If we could predict that, man, we'd be really rich people, right? But we cannot do that. But actually, one of the goals of corporate strategy is to help a client determine where a market is going to go, and we look for trends. Now, obviously, trends come and go, but there's some underlying trends that you try to leverage, right? Like, for example, in this situation where these countries are running out of power, we can say with a high degree of certainty for the next 25 years, building generation, transmission, distribution lines is going to be a trend that there's a 95% probability of panning out as we plan. Now, we can't say with 100% probability because the government could come along and dismantle regulation in the sector, privatize it, and allow private sector investors in, and this utility gets cut out. You cannot predict markets, and I would honestly advise you to read the book. Right? It's a great book. It teaches you one of the two problems in corporate strategy. One is picking the objective function. What do you want to be? And what do you want to be is partly driven by where the market is going. And you can say, I want to be the world's greatest company at making combustion engines that belch smoke and make so much noise that babies wake up when you drive by. Because the reality is that while you have the competencies and the manpower to do that and the know-how and the patents, the market is disappearing. So, the first part of corporate strategy, you pick the market. And then you decide how the objective function is going to be arranged to maximize your position in that market. Right? Obviously, that is logical. So, when you are doing corporate strategy work, remember that you're always picking a market first and then deciding how the company is going to play in that market. People call this market entry strategy, but this is not market entry strategy. In market entry strategy, a company has a great core business, great core competency, great skills, and they're bringing those to a new market. That's market entry strategy. In corporate strategy, the company has to reinvent who it is. And to decide who it's going to be and whether it's worth being that person, you first pick the market and then you determine how the company is going to be the person to play in that market. That's why it's not market entry strategy. The context, the changes are not comparable at all, right? So when you're thinking about corporate strategy, remember, you're always picking a market first. And you have to be pretty damn good at picking a market. And the way you pick a market is you find a trend that has a low probability of disruption in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, I would say that is difficult to do in some sectors like cosmetics. Well, actually not cosmetics, that's easy to do, but I would say in technology that's hard to do. Sectors where it's easy to do is where you have high barriers to entry, building of dams, building of power stations, building of mines. It's hard. It's not impossible. I mean, you build a mine, everything looks hunky-dory now, but next year the market collapses, oil prices collapse, and you're stuck with something called the Gorgon gas fields in Australia, whereby the price of oil and gas is now half of what you needed to be to break even, and you stuck with it. So a market can disappear. But because of the long build times of these projects, you hope the market will disappear and recover by the time the project is ready to start pumping gas. So, to recap, remember, corporate strategy projects always are defined by two important characteristics, right? One, you have to be picking a market for a client. Second, the objective function cannot be clear when you join the study. If the objective function is given to you and you're maximizing it, then you're not doing corporate strategy. You're probably doing a market entry strategy, an investment case, or something like that, but it's not corporate strategy. So as always, thank you for listening to this podcast. Remember, it's build up to week 4 of the power sector study, which we cover in much, much more detail in the executive program. I believe at last count there were 650 videos just for this study, and there's probably something like 350 for the other studies as well.